People always ask me what the worst part was. They expect me to say the cold or the shooting or the part where we almost didn't make it back. It wasn't any of that. The worst part was the voice on the radio telling us no. I was 26 years old, a crew chief on a heavy-lift helicopter, and I had heard that voice give 100 orders before. Calm voice, reasonable voice. The kind of voice that sounds like it's already decided and is just being polite about telling you. And on Christmas Eve, with 12 men freezing on the side of a mountain, that voice said the mission was scrubbed. I watched the woman sitting in the pilot's seat hear those words. I watched her jaw move just barely, like she was chewing on something that tasted wrong. And I knew, the way you know things you can't explain later, that she was not going to listen. Let me back up. You need to understand how we got there, or none of the rest of it will land the way it should. I won't tell you exactly where we were. I'm not allowed, and honestly the name wouldn't mean anything to you. Picture a part of the world where the mountains go up so high and so sudden that the weather has its own opinions, and those opinions change every 20 minutes. Picture snow that doesn't fall so much as get thrown sideways at you. Picture a little forward base that was really just a cluster of plywood and canvas and one stubborn old hangar, sitting in a bowl of rock at the edge of nowhere. That was home for our crew that winter. 3 aircraft, a handful of pilots, a fuel point, and a coffee pot that ran 24 hours a day because nobody in their right mind slept all the way through a night out there. The pilot in command of my bird was Chief Warrant Officer Maren Holt. I want to describe her right because most people, when they imagine somebody who does what she did, they picture somebody loud, somebody who slams doors and gives speeches. Maren wasn't like that at all. She was quiet in a way that made other people quiet around her. She had this habit of listening to you completely all the way to the end of your sentence before she said anything back. In our world, that's rare. Most folks are already loading their answer while you're still talking. She'd been flying for 13 years by then. She had hands like she'd been born holding the controls. I'd flown with a lot of pilots and most of them muscle the aircraft around, fighting it like it's a thing that needs tamming. Maren flew like she was asking the helicopter a favor and it kept saying yes. Smooth, almost gentle. You'd be in the back with your stomach somewhere up near your ears in bad weather and she'd just talk, low and steady, telling you what she was seeing, and somehow that voice made the whole machine feel like it knew what it was doing. She had a kid back home, a daughter 8 years old. There was a drawing taped to the inside of her helmet bag, a crayon thing of a stick figure family standing under a yellow sun, and she'd never explained it and nobody ever asked. We all had our drawings. You learn not to poke at those. The other thing about Maren is that she didn't break rules. That's the part people don't believe when I tell this story. They think the woman who defied orders must have been some kind of cowboy, somebody who was always one bad day away from getting thrown out. The opposite. She was the most by-the-book pilot on that base. She'd turn around and come home over a warning light that everybody else would have ignored. She'd ground an aircraft for a discrepancy nobody could even find. Once she made us scrub a milk run because the cloud ceiling was 50 feet lower than the minimum, and the other pilots gave her grief for it for a week. So you have to understand, when somebody like that decides to break the biggest rule there is, it isn't because she doesn't respect the rules, it's because she's found something heavier than the rule. That something was 12 men. They weren't ours technically. They were a SEAL element, the kind of guys who came through our base sometimes, did their work and left without telling us much. We knew them the way you know people you share a chow tent with for a few weeks. Faces, first names, sometimes nicknames. The big one who could eat 4 trays of food and was still hungry. The skinny kid who carried a paperback everywhere and read it during anything that wasn't an emergency. The team leader, a senior chief named Reyes who had a gray mustache and a way of looking at you that made you stand up a little straighter even when he was just asking to borrow a wrench. There were a few more I knew by face. A medic they called Doc, which is what everybody calls the medic, so that doesn't help you. A radio guy named Prout with a laugh you could hear 3/10 over. The rest I couldn't have picked out of a lineup, and I felt bad about that for years, because by the time the night was over I cared about every single one of them more than I've cared about most people I've known my whole life. The mission they went out on was supposed to be quick. 2-3 days at most. Go up into the high country, watch a thing, come back. I don't know the details and you don't need them. What you need to know is that on the 3rd day, the thing they were watching turned out to be watching them too, and quick turned into a problem. We got the first hint of it around dusk on the 23rd. Radio chatter. The kind of tight, clipped voices that mean people are working a situation and don't have spare breath for politeness. Reyes' element had been compromised. They'd had to move fast away from where they were supposed to be, up higher into a draw between 2 ridgelines where the enemy couldn't easily follow but also where a helicopter couldn't easily land. They had wounded. They had a dwindling amount of everything that mattered, ammunition and water and warmth, and they had weather coming in. That last part was what made everybody's stomach drop. I remember standing in the operations tent that evening, the canvas snapping in the wind, the maps glowing under the work lights, and the meteorologist, a soft-spoken guy named Owens who looked permanently apologetic, putting up the forecast. He didn't have to say much. The whole front office went quiet looking at it. A storm system, enormous, was rolling down out of the north, and it was going to swallow the entire region by midnight on the 24th and not let go for the better part of 2 days. In plain terms, there was a window, a narrow one. We could go get those men before the storm closed the door, or we could wait for the storm to pass, and the math on the waiting was the kind of math nobody wanted to say out loud. 12 men, some of them hurt, no resupply, exposed on a mountain for 2 days in a storm with the enemy somewhere below them looking to climb up. You didn't need a calculator. You just needed to look at the faces in that tent. So a rescue got put together, fast. That's the part the movies actually get right, how fast it can come together when it has to. 2 aircraft. Mine with Marin up front and a second bird flown by a good pilot named Castellano, a small security element to put on the ground. A plan that was more hope than plan, because the only place we could possibly set down near those men was a shelf of rock barely bigger than the aircraft itself, at an altitude where the air is so thin the rotors have to work twice as hard to hold you up. We were going to launch at first light on the 24th, beat the storm, get them and go. And then that night the order came down to wait. I wasn't in the room when it happened, but I heard it secondhand, and I heard it the same way 3 different times from 3 different people, so I believe it. Higher command, and I mean higher, the kind of command that's far away in a warm building looking at the same forecast we were looking at, decided the risk was unacceptable. 2 aircraft, full crews, a ground element, flown into the teeth of a building storm to land on a postage stamp at the edge of survivable altitude, in the dark, in the cold, with the enemy nearby. The odds, somebody decided, were that we'd lose the rescue birds and everyone on them and still not get the 12 men out. Better, the thinking went, to wait out the storm, to trust those 12 men to hold on, to go in clean after the weather broke. I want to be fair to the people who made that call. I've thought about it for years and I still don't think they were monsters. They were doing the math too. They were responsible for everybody, not just the 12, and from where they sat, sending more people to die didn't bring anybody home. There's a cold logic to it that's hard to argue with on paper. But Marin wasn't on paper. None of us were. We were in a freezing tent at the bottom of a mountain, listening to a senior chief named Reyes on the radio. His voice getting flatter and more tired with every transmission, telling us his men were okay, they were holding, don't worry about them. And every one of us could hear underneath the words that they were not okay, and that he knew it, and that he was saying it anyway because that's what you do. I remember the moment the scrub came down to us officially. Marin was sitting on an empty fuel can outside the hangar, drinking coffee out of a metal cup, looking up at the sky. You couldn't see stars. The clouds were already coming, a thick gray lid sliding over everything. The temperature had been dropping all evening and you could feel it in your teeth. The operations officer came out to tell her, a decent man, Major Lindqvist, who clearly hated what he was carrying. He told her the mission was off until the storm passed. He told her it came from way up the chain and there was no arguing it. He told her, and I think this is the part that did it, that the 12 men had been informed and had acknowledged, and were going to hold position and wait for the weather to clear. Marin didn't say anything for a long time, she just looked at her coffee. Then she asked him one question very quietly. What did they say when you told them? Lindqvist hesitated, and then, because he was a decent man and couldn't lie to her, he told her the truth. He said Reyes had acknowledged the order, and then Reyes had said one more thing before he signed off. He'd said, tell them we understand, tell them Merry Christmas. I watched Marin's face when she heard that. The work lights from the hangar were hitting one side of it. She didn't cry. She didn't get angry. She just got very, very still, the way water gets still right before it freezes, and she set her coffee cup down on the gravel beside the fuel can, careful, like it was something that could break. And she said, mostly to herself, Merry Christmas. Then she looked up at the sky again, at that gray lid coming in, and I swear I could see her doing the math. Her own math, not the math from the warm building far away. A different equation entirely, one with different numbers in it. Numbers like a senior chief saying Merry Christmas to the men who weren't going to come get him, and a stick-figure family under a yellow sun, and the 13 years she'd spent learning exactly what her aircraft could and couldn't do. I didn't know yet what she'd decided, but I knew the look. I'd seen it on her before, smaller versions of it, the look she got right before she committed to a landing she wasn't sure about. The look of somebody who has stopped asking whether they can and started figuring out how. She stood up, she picked her coffee cup back up off the gravel, drank what was left and walked into the hangar. I followed her because that was my job and also because I couldn't not. Inside, the rest of the crew was scattered around, doing the slow, miserable work of standing down, securing equipment that had been laid out to load. Castellano was over by his aircraft talking quiet with his co-pilot. There was a radio in the corner of the hangar and it was still on, still patched into the net, and you could hear the faint occasional traffic from up the mountain. Ray's element checking in, holding. Marin walked over to that radio and stood next to it for a while just listening. The skinny kid with the paperback, I learned later his name was Tomasi, was the one transmitting now, his voice young and trying hard to sound older. He was reporting their status. Cold, low on ammunition. 2 wounded, one of them bad. Then a pause, and then Tomasi said something he probably shouldn't have said over an official net, but he was young and tired and it was Christmas Eve and he was scared. He said, "It's real pretty up here actually, with the snow coming, wish you guys could see it." And then quieter, "We're gonna be fine." I watched Marin close her eyes when he said that, just for a second, like she was taking a picture of the sound. Then she opened them and she turned around and she looked at me specifically, and she said, "Navarro, get me Castellano and find Stahl." Stahl was our flight medic, a wiry woman who could keep a person alive with 2 fingers and a prayer. Quietly, Marin said, "I want to talk to them before anybody goes to sleep." I should have asked what for. I knew what for. I went and got them anyway because somewhere in the last 10 minutes I'd made my own decision without quite realizing it, and the decision was that wherever this woman was going, I was going too. The wind was picking up outside. You could hear it starting to find the gaps in the hangar walls, that low moaning sound that means the weather's about to get serious. Somewhere up on a black mountain, 12 men were watching the snow come down and telling each other they were going to be fine. And in a cold plywood hangar at the bottom of the world, a quiet woman who never broke a rule in her life was about to break the biggest one there is. I've told this story a lot of times now. To my kids when they got old enough. To other crews late at night when somebody asks about the worst thing or the best thing, and for me they turned out to be the same thing. And every time I tell it I get to this exact point, the part right before everything happens, and I have to stop for a second. Because I want you to understand what we knew, standing in that hangar. We knew the order. We knew it came from people who weren't stupid and weren't cruel. We knew the storm was real and the altitude was real and the postage stamp landing zone in the dark was real. And we knew that the smart money, the safe money, the money that kept you alive and kept your career intact and let you go home to your own stick-figure family, was on doing what we were told. We knew all of that. And we were about to go anyway. I'll tell you how we did it and what happened on that mountain and what it cost. But not yet. Right now I want to leave us there in the hangar in the cold with the wind starting to moan and the coffee going bitter and a young man's voice on the radio saying we're gonna be fine. Because that's the moment I keep going back to. That's the moment everything could still have gone the other way. That's the moment a person gets to decide what kind of person they are. Marin Holt looked at the 3 of us, me, Castellano, Stahl, standing in a loose little circle under the work lights, and she didn't give a speech. She wasn't a speech person. She just said, plain and quiet, the way she said everything. They told 12 of our guys Merry Christmas and left them on a mountain. I'm not doing that, you don't have to come, but I'm going to go get them. And outside, the snow kept coming down. Here's the thing nobody tells you about deciding to do something you're not supposed to do. It's not the deciding that's hard. The deciding takes about a second. What's hard is everything that comes after, all the small, ordinary things you have to do with your hands while your whole body is screaming that this is a mistake. We had to fuel the aircraft. We had to pull the covers and run the checks and load the gear, and we had to do all of it without making it look like we were doing it, because the moment somebody up the chain realized what was happening, they'd put a stop to it, and they'd be right too. Marin didn't lie to anybody. I want that on the record because it matters. She never said she wasn't going. She just didn't announce that she was. There's a difference, and she lived in that difference for about 40 minutes that night, moving quiet and steady through the hangar, and the rest of us moved with her. Castellano was in. I knew he would be the second Marin said it. He had 2 daughters of his own and a face like a tired bulldog and a thing he believed about people, which was that you don't leave them. That's the whole of it. You don't leave them. He didn't need any more reason than that. His co-pilot was a younger warrant named Dell, and Dell took longer. I watched him work it through. He was newer, he had less rope, and going up that mountain meant the end of something for him whether we got the men or not. He He stood by his aircraft for a long couple of minutes with his hands jammed in his armpits against the cold, and then he just nodded once to nobody and started doing his pre-flight. Nobody made him. I've thought about that a lot. Nobody made any of us. Stahl the medic didn't even pretend to think about it. She'd already gone for her aid bag before Marin finished the sentence. Stahl had a thing she used to say, which was that the worst thing you could do to her was make her sit somewhere safe while she knew somebody was bleeding out within reach. She said staying behind would kill her slower, but just as dead. She was half joking, only half. The security element was 4 guys. A small fire team led by a sergeant named Boone, and here's where it gets complicated because those 4 weren't ours. They were attached, they were under orders, and Marin couldn't ask them to throw their careers in the fire on her say-so. So she didn't ask. She told Boone exactly what she was going to do and exactly what it would cost and told him he and his men were free to stay, and that nobody would think less of them, and that she'd say on the record they'd never been told. Boone listened to the whole thing. He was maybe 23. He had a little silver cross on a chain that he wore outside his gear, which was against about 4 regulations, and he held onto it while she talked. And when she was done he said, "Chief, it's Christmas Eve. I'm not real interested in explaining to anybody ever that I sat on my hands on Christmas Eve." So that was 11 of us, Marin and Dell and me on one bird, Castellano and his co-pilot and his crew chief on the other. Stahl split between us by the door, and Boone's 4 loaded in the back of mine with their weapons and their cold-weather gear and that little silver cross. 11 going up to get 12. We didn't tell operations, not the way you're supposed to. What Marin did do, and I'll never forget it, was walk over to the operations tent right before we launched and stick her head in and find Major Linkfist, the decent man who'd carried the bad news to her earlier. And she said to him, just to him, "I'm going to go warm up the aircraft, run the systems, the cold's hard on them sitting," which was true, it's a thing you do. And Linkfist looked at her for a long moment, and he knew, I am certain he knew, exactly what she meant by warming up the aircraft, and he could have stopped her right there. One word. He didn't say the word, he said, "Be careful with the number 2 engine on yours, it's been running hot." And he held her eyes for one more second, and then he looked back down at his maps. I think about Linkfist almost as much as I think about Marin, about what it costs a person to look away on purpose, about the kind of courage that doesn't get a medal because it can't ever be admitted out loud. We launched at a few minutes before midnight. I remember the world tilting as we came up off the pad, the lights of the little base swinging away below us and then vanishing into the dark, and then there was nothing out the door but black and the first hard pellets of snow coming sideways into the cabin. The cold hit like a wall. We were flying with the door open because that's how I work, that's where the gun is and where my eyes are, and within about 90 seconds my face had gone from cold to numb to a kind of burning that you stop noticing because you have to. Marin's voice came over the intercom, low and even. "Climbing out, Castellano, you on me." "Right behind you, lead." Castellano's bird was a shape in the murk off our left, a darker dark with a faint blink of light, and then the clouds swallowed it and it was just a voice. I need to try to make you understand what the flying was like, because the flying is the part where Marin earned everything. It's the part you can't see in any story. We were climbing into a storm that Command had correctly said was unflyable. The wind up there wasn't whine the way you think of wind. It was a living thing, slamming us from one side and then dropping out from under us so the whole aircraft felt like the floor had been pulled away, and then catching us again and shoving us toward rock we couldn't see. The snow came so thick in the landing lights that turning them on made it worse, like driving into a wall of static, so we flew mostly dark, on instruments, on Marin's hands and Marin's head and 13 years of knowing. And the altitude, I keep coming back to the altitude because people don't understand it. Up high the air gets thin, and a helicopter is just a machine for pushing against air. The thinner the air, the less there is to push against, and the harder the engines and the rotors have to work just to keep you from falling. We were heavy, full fuel, 11 people, all the gear, and we were going up to where the air gets thin enough that the aircraft is right at the edge of what it can physically do. Add the cold, which changes everything, and the wind, which changes everything else, and you've got a margin so thin it's not really a margin at all. It's a wish. Marin flew it like it was a wish she intended to come true. I could hear her talking the whole way up, not to us exactly, to the aircraft, to herself, a low continuous murmur calling out what she was seeing and what she was doing, nomming it as it happened. "Easy now, there's the ridge holding off it, watch the downflow on the lee side, here it comes, riding it down, riding it and back up. Good, good girl." I don't know if she was talking to the helicopter or to herself or to her daughter or to God, maybe all of them, it didn't matter. The voice did the thing it always did. It made the impossible feel like a series of small manageable problems, one after another, each one solvable, none of them the whole mountain at once. Up front, Dell was reading instruments out loud, fast and clean, his voice tight but steady, and somewhere in the dark Castellano was doing the same dance in his own aircraft, the two of them threading the same needle 100 yards apart and unable to see each other at all. About 20 minutes into the climb, we lost an engine. Not all the way. The number 2, the one Lindqvist had warned her about, the one running hot, surged and then sagged, and a warning light came on and the aircraft gave a sick little shudder. I felt my stomach go to ice in a way the cold hadn't managed. Dell's voice jumped an octave calling it out, and I remember in that second thinking very clearly, this is it, this is where it ends, we're going to spread ourselves across a mountain on Christmas Eve, and they were right all along. And Marin's voice didn't change, not even a little. She said, I've got it. Like she was telling you she'd grabbed the last cup of coffee. She nursed that engine. I don't have the words for what she did with her hands and her feet because I'm not a pilot, but I know that a lesser pilot loses the aircraft right there, and she didn't. She backed us off the climb, found a pocket of stiller air in the lee of something, let the engine cool and breathe, coaxed it back, and brought us up the rest of the way on an engine and a half and her own refusal to die. Still with me, lead, Castellano from the dark. Still here, Marin said, number 2's being dramatic, we're fine. We were not fine, but that's not the point. The point is what she gave the rest of us by saying it. 11 people in 2 aircraft in a storm at the edge of the sky, every one of us privately certain we were about to die, and her voice came across the net flat and dry and a little annoyed at the engine, like the worst thing happening was an inconvenience, and that voice held us all together. Fear is contagious, so is calm, she knew that. I think she'd always known that, and I think it was the realest weapon she had, realer than any of the steel we were carrying. We came up over the last ridgeline maybe 40 minutes after we'd left, and there, in a draw between 2 black walls of rock, was the shelf. I saw it for half a second in a gap in the snow. A pale ledge sloped barely there with the mountain falling away on one side into nothing, and on it tiny were lights. Infrared strobes, the kind you can only see through the goggles, blinking in a pattern, 12 men marking themselves, telling us where they were, telling us they were still alive to do the marking. I keyed up and reported them. I tried to keep my voice like Marin's, flat and easy, and I mostly failed, and I didn't care. Strobes in sight, they're there, chief, they're there, I count, and I tried to count, and the snow took them away and gave them back. Multiple, they're alive. Nobody cheered. You don't, not in that work, not when the hardest part is still in front of you. But I heard Stahl let out a long breath beside me at the door, and I heard Boone in the back say something quiet that might have been a prayer, holding that little silver cross, and up front Marin said only, okay, very softly, like a person who had just been handed the thing she came for and now had to figure out how to carry it. Because seeing them was one thing, getting to them was another. The shelf was too small for both aircraft. It was barely big enough for one, and it was sloped, and it was at the exact altitude where the air gave you almost nothing to fly on, and the wind was funneling through that draw like water through a hose, gusting and dying and gusting again. The plan, what little plan there was, had been to put both birds down and load fast. That plan died the moment Marin saw the shelf. There was room for one, maybe. Castellano, her voice steady. It's a 1 aircraft LZ, I'm going in, you hold high and dry, you stay airworthy, and if I go in that hole you come get who you can, you hear me. A pause. I could feel Castellano not wanting to agree to that, to circle in the storm and watch and do nothing while she set down on a sloped postage stamp on 1.5 engines. Lead, let me. That's an order, Cass? First time she'd ever pulled rank on him in the years I'd watched them fly together. Somebody airworthy has to be up here, it's you, hold high. A longer pause, then low, holding high, go get him, Marin. She brought us around. I want to slow down here because this was the thing. This was the whole night compressed into about 90 seconds, the approach to that shelf. She had to fly us into a slot between 2 rock walls she couldn't really see, in a crosswind that wanted to throw us into one wall or the other, descending to a sloped surface at an altitude where the engines had nothing left to give, with one of those engines already sick. There was no margin to abort low. Once she committed past a certain point, we were landing or we were crashing, and those were the only 2 outcomes on the menu. She started talking again, the murmur. Coming left, watch the wall, Del, give me the radar altimeter, give me numbers. Del calling feet above ground, his voice cracking. 80, 70, drifting right, chief, I see it, I've got it. A gust hit us and the whole aircraft skated sideways toward the rock and my heart stopped and Marin caught it, just caught it, with a correction so fine I didn't even feel the moment she made it, only the moment after when we were straight again. 50, 40. Winds dropping, writing it down, writing it, easy. I was hanging out the door watching the rock come up at us and watching the lights of the 12 men resolve into shapes. Actual men now, men in white-crusted gear hunched against the rotor wash that was blasting snow off the shelf in a blinding cloud. Men starting to move toward us before we were even down because they knew this was their one chance and the window was the width of a knife. 30, 20, Dell's voice was barely holding. 10, Chief, the slope. I see the slope. And then we were down. Not flat, she put us down on a slope with one wheel touching and the other hanging, holding the aircraft half flying, half landed, balanced on the edge of the mountain and the edge of the air and the edge of everything, holding it there with her hands because to actually set down fully would have been to slide off into the dark. Holding a 30,000-pound machine perfectly still on a slope in a storm on 1.5 engines, by main strength and by will, for as long as it took to load 12 men. Go, she said, and her voice finally had something in it, a strain, a human edge, the cost of what she was doing leaking through for the first time all night. Get them, fast, I can't hold this long, go Navarro, go. And the back of the aircraft opened up to the storm, and Boone's men were out, and Stahl was out. And 12 frozen, exhausted men who had said Merry Christmas and meant goodbye were stumbling toward the open door of a helicopter that should not have been there, that no order had sent, that one quiet woman had flown into the impossible on the strength of refusing to leave them. I reached out into the snow and the rotor wash and grabbed the first hand that reached back. It was the senior chief. Ray's, the gray mustache caked white with ice, his eyes wide, and I will never as long as I live forget the look on his face when he understood that we'd come, that somebody had come, that the Merry Christmas hadn't been the last thing after all. He grabbed my forearm with both hands. He was shouting over the engines and the wind, and I could barely hear him, but I read it on his mouth as much as heard it. You came, you came. I hauled him in, and behind him, out in the snow, 11 more were coming. But the window was closing. The storm was right on top of us now, the real heart of it, and the aircraft was screaming under Marin's hands, and we still had to load 11 more men and 2 wounded and ourselves, and somehow lift a heavier aircraft off a slope at an altitude that hadn't wanted us light. The hardest part of the whole night was still in front of us, and I'll tell you about it. But first let me leave you here with a senior chief's frozen hands locked around my arm and a woman holding a mountain still by sheer refusal and 12 men running through the snow toward home. You came, he said, you came. Yeah, Chief, we came. Loading 12 men into a helicopter takes longer than you'd think. In a training environment on flat ground on a nice day, it's quick. Up there, it was an eternity made of seconds. They came in waves. Ray's first hauled in by me, and the second he was inside he turned around and started doing what every good leader does, which is forget about himself entirely. He planted himself by the door and started grabbing his own men as they came and shoving them deeper into the cabin, counting them, shouting names into the wind I couldn't hear, keeping the count in his head because if there's one thing a man like that will never do, it's leave without knowing the number. The 2 wounded came next, and that's where Stahl earned her place on the aircraft. One of them could sort of walk, leaning on a teammate, his leg wrong in a way I didn't look at too closely. The other one couldn't do anything. They carried him. 4 men carried him through the snow on a litter they'd rigged out of God knows what, and Stahl was out there in it before they reached the door, her hands already moving, already working, walking backward into the rotor wash with her eyes locked on the man on the litter like nothing else in the world existed. They got him in. She got in over him, on top of him almost, doing something to his chest, and she never stopped, not for a second, not the whole way down. The skinny kid, Tomasi, the one with the paperback and the young voice on the radio, the one who'd said it's real pretty up here, he was one of the last. He came stumbling through the snow and Boone caught him and threw him bodily into the cabin and Tomasi landed half on top of me, and for 1 second our faces were about a foot apart and his eyes were doing the thing eyes do when a person has spent a long time being brave and can finally stop. He didn't cry. He just looked at me like he was checking whether I was real. I grabbed the back of his neck the way you do, forehead to forehead for half a second, and I shouted, "Merry Christmas, kid!" and something broke open in his face, and then I shoved him deeper in and turned back for the next one. The whole time the aircraft was alive and fighting under us. I could feel it through my boots, through the floor, the strain of what Marin was doing. She had us balanced on that slope on one wheel, half the weight on the rock and half on the rotors, and every man we loaded made the aircraft heavier, and every pound of heavier at that altitude on that engine was a pound closer to the edge of what was possible. I could hear it in the engines. A sound I'd never heard before and have only heard a couple of times since, the sound of turbines being asked for everything they had and a little bit more. And I could hear Marin, still talking, lower now, more strain in it but still nomming it, still working the problem. Hold the slope, hold it, don't slide, stay with me, how many, Navarro, how many? I looked at Reyes. Reyes was counting, his lips moving, his hand chopping the air as each man came aboard. He held up a number with frozen fingers. Then he held up one more finger and shouted something and pointed back out into the snow. One more, there was one more out there. The last man was Prout, the radio guy with the laugh you could hear 3/10 over, and he wasn't running because he'd gone back. That's the kind of thing those men did, the thing that breaks your heart about them. In the chaos of loading, with the storm coming down and a helicopter screaming on a slope, Prout had turned around and gone back across the shelf to make sure they hadn't left any sensitive gear, any radios, anything that couldn't fall into the wrong hands, even then. Even with the door of the only aircraft in the world open and waiting, he went back to do his job. Boone went after him, just took off into the snow without a word, and for about 10 seconds, the longest 10 seconds of my life, there were two men out there in the white and the dark, and I couldn't see either of them, and the engines were screaming, and Marin's voice came over the net with the first real fear I'd heard in it all night. I'm losing the slope, the wind's shifting. I cannot hold this much longer, where are they? And then they came out of the snow together, Boone and Prout, Boone half dragging him, Prout clutching a bag of gear to his chest like a baby, and they dove for the door and I caught them both and hauled with everything I had, and they were in, they were all in. I screamed it, that's 12, Reyes confirmed 12. Reyes grabbed my shoulder, his face an inch from mine, and he roared, 12, all 12, G.O. All 12, Chief, I shouted up front, everybody's in, G.O. 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 And Marin said, hang on. Here's the part I can't fully explain even now, getting onto that slope was hard. Getting off it was harder because now we were heavier, 11 of us plus 12 of them, 23 souls and all their gear, a far heavier aircraft than the one that had barely made it up, and we had to break free of the slope and lift, straight up out of a slot between two rock walls in a shifting wind on an engine and a half, at an altitude where a fully loaded aircraft simply does not have the power to climb. The book says it can't be done. I've talked to pilots about it since. They run the numbers and they shake their heads. The aircraft did not have the power to do what Marin did next. So she didn't climb, she fell. She picked the aircraft up off the slope, and instead of trying to fight straight up out of the slot, which would have killed us, she rolled us off the edge of the shelf into the dark, into the 1,000 feet of nothing that fell away on the open side, and she traded that altitude for speed. She let us drop. The whole aircraft dropped into the black void off the side of the mountain, the floor falling away under us, men shouting, my own stomach somewhere up around my eyes, and she rode that fall nose down, gathering speed she didn't have the power to gather any other way, until the air going over the rotors was fast enough to fly on, and then only then she pulled us level, a few hundred feet above the valley floor, screaming through the storm now with airspeed under us instead of altitude, alive, all of us. Flying. She'd flown us off a cliff on purpose because falling was the only way up. There was a sound in the back of the aircraft when she leveled us out, and it took me a second to understand what it was. It was 12 men and a security team and a medic all making noise at once, a ragged, half-sobbing, half-laughing roar, the sound human beings make when they understand they are not going to die after all. Reyes had both hands over his face. Tomasi was holding onto another man and shaking. Stahl never looked up. She was still working on the man on the litter who I'm told lived, who I'm told is alive right now with grandchildren, but I saw her shoulders drop about an inch, and for Stahl that was the same as anybody else falling on the floor in tears. And up front, Marin said on the net, steady again, dry again, the strain gone back under wherever she kept it. Castellano leads off the LZ with all 12, RTB. A long crackle of static, and then Castellano's voice, and I have never heard a grown man's voice do what his did, trying to sound normal and failing all the way. Copy that lead, all 12 following you home. We flew down out of that storm into the cold, clear dark below it, 2 aircraft, 20-some people, and I sat in the open door with the wind on my numb face and a senior chief's hand still gripping my knee like he was afraid I'd disappear, and I looked out at the night, and somewhere down there were the lights of our little base coming up, and I thought, it's Christmas. It's actually Christmas now, past midnight. We did this on Christmas. I'd love to tell you that's where the story ends. The hero flies them home, everybody cheers, the end. It's not where it ends, and I'd be lying to you if I let you think it was. Because there was a reckoning waiting on the ground, and Marin knew it the whole time. She'd known it before she ever started the engines. That's the part I most want you to understand about her, the part that took me years to really get. She didn't do what she did in a moment of passion, swept up not thinking. she thought about all of it. She knew, sitting on that fuel can with her coffee, that if she launched against a direct order from high command, then even if she pulled off the most impossible flight of her life and brought every man home, she would have ended her career doing it. Maybe worse than ended it. There are words for disobeying orders, and they're not gentle words. She knew that, and she'd done the math anyway, and the math came out the same. 12 men were worth more than her career. They were worth more than her good record and her clean reputation and the 13 years she'd spent never breaking a rule. She put all of it on the table, every bit of it, and she pushed it into the pot, and she flew into the storm. When we landed, there were people waiting. Of course there were. Word travels. 2 aircraft launching into an unflyable storm against a direct order is not a quiet thing. There were senior people on that pad who had not authorized any of this and whose faces, when the ramp came down and 12 impossible men walked off, did a complicated thing I'll never forget. Anger and relief and confusion all at war, because they were standing there looking at proof that the thing they'd called impossible had just been done, and looking at a pilot who'd flagrantly defied them to do it. Marin shut the aircraft down. She did her checks, every one of them same as always, by the book to the last item even now. Then she climbed out, and she walked across the pad past the men she'd saved, who were trying to get to her, who wanted to put their hands on her and couldn't find the words. Ray's especially. Ray's was a wreck, that hard old man, completely undone. She walked past all of it, straight to the senior officer waiting for her, and she stood at attention in the snow and she said, "Chief Warrant Officer Holt, I launched against orders. The decision and the responsibility are mine alone. My crews followed me on my authority. Whatever happens, happens to me. Whatever happens, happens to me." She protected every one of us with that sentence, stood there in the cold and took the whole weight of it onto her own back so that none of it would land on Dell or Castellano or Boone's young men or me. She'd flown us off a cliff to save us once already that night, and now she was doing it again, a different way. I won't tell you everything that came after, because some of it I don't have the right to, and some of it would take another whole telling. There were investigations. There were rooms with serious people in them and serious questions. For a while it looked very bad for her, and she never once complained about it, never once said it wasn't fair, because she'd known going in exactly what she was buying. I'll tell you the one thing I can tell you, the thing that I think matters most. The 12 men did not stay quiet. Rays did not stay quiet. A senior chief who'd spent his whole life keeping his mouth shut and following orders stood up in those rooms, and in front of those serious people, and said in that flat, hard voice of his, that he and his 11 men were alive on Christmas morning because one warrant officer had refused to leave them on a mountain. He said it over and over to anyone who would hear it. The wounded man Stahl saved said it. Tomasi, the kid, said it, and Tomasi's mother said it, in a letter that I'm told got read out in a place where it mattered. 12 families who had almost gotten the worst phone call of their lives on Christmas Eve instead got their men back, and 12 families do not stay quiet. I don't know how to measure whether the system did right by her in the end. The system is the system, it does what it does, but I know she kept flying, I know that much. I know there came a day when the storm of all of it passed, the way the real storm passed, and she was still in a cockpit, still talking low and steady to her aircraft, still bringing people home. That's the most I'm allowed to say, and it's more than I expected to be able to say, those first dark weeks when it looked like they'd take everything from her. I left that part of the service a few years later, went home, got married, had kids of my own, taped their drawings to things. I think about that night every Christmas Eve without fail. When the snow comes down, we get snow where I live now. I go out and stand in it for a minute by myself, and I let it land on my face the way it landed on my face in that open door, and I think about 12 men and a security team and a medic who never looked up, and a pilot who fell off a cliff so we could fly. People ask me when I tell this whether she was scared. Marin, up there, they always want to know that. And I tell them the truth, which is that I don't know, because she never let it into her voice and I never asked her. And there's no asking now in a way that would get a straight answer, because she's not the type who'd give you one. But I'll tell you what I believe. I believe she was scared the whole time. I believe she was as scared as any of us, maybe more, because she understood better than any of us exactly how thin the margins were, and exactly what it would cost her even if it worked. I believe she was terrified. And I believe that's the whole point, because brave isn't the absence of being scared. I learned that on a mountain on Christmas Eve. Brave is being scared all the way down to the bottom of yourself and flying into the storm anyway, because somewhere up there are 12 people who were told Merry Christmas and left behind, and you have decided, you alone have decided, that not one of them is going to spend the night believing that nobody was coming. They told 12 of our guys Merry Christmas and left them on a mountain. She wasn't going to do that. So she went and got them, all 12, and she brought them home.